In 1912, American author Edgar Rice Burroughs published the first of his novels in the Barsoom series, also known as the Martian series, A Princess of Mars. Burroughs was born in 1875 in Chicago, Illinois, to Mary Ziegler and Major George Tyler Burroughs, a veteran of the American Civil War. Prior to becoming an author, Burroughs struggled to find success in any of the arenas he attempted, of which there were many. He tried to join the military like his father, enlisting at the U.S. Military Academy West Point, but failed to pass the entrance exam. Afterwards, he enlisted with the 7th U.S. Cavalry instead, stationed in Fort Grant, Arizona, which was still only a territory at the time. Unfortunately for Burroughs, he was later diagnosed with a heart condition, and thus discharged. Other reports say, however, that Burroughs wasn't terribly keen on his post, and had his father arrange the discharge through political friends. Evidence in support of this notion arguably comes from Burroughs himself. As he was quoted regarding the top sergeant of his troop, "He would have been nice to me if I had bought beer for him, and if I had to do it over again, I would keep him soused indefinitely, for by that route would have come favors and promotion." Besides his short-lived military career, Burroughs was also a cowboy, a shopkeeper, a policeman, a gold miner, and an accountant. All of his attempted business ventures sank one after another, and it may have been this discouraging reality that prompted him to begin privately exploring worlds of fantasy in his writing. By the time Burroughs was a father of 2 with a 3rd child on the way, he and his family were in a desperate situation. His latest independent business had failed, and Burroughs had to pawn his wife's jewelry in order to afford food. "I loathed poverty," he said, "and should have liked to put my hands on the man who said poverty is an honorable state. There is nothing honorable or fine about it. To be poor is quite bad enough, but to be poor without hope, well, the only way to understand it is to be it." It was at this point that Burroughs began to write his first story. Under the pseudonym Norman Bean, he submitted the first half of a draft to the editor of the all-story magazine, Thomas Metcalf. Metcalf wrote back that he enjoyed it, and if the second half was just as good, the magazine would run it. Burroughs said, "Had he not given me this encouragement, I never would have finished the story, and my writing career would have been at an end, since I was not writing for any particular love of writing. I was writing because I had a wife and 2 babies, a combination which does not work well without money." Burroughs' pseudonym, Norman Bean, was actually not his original name. It was Normal Bean. Burroughs wanted to emphasize that he was in his right mind. He was nervous that the public would believe him ridiculous or even mad for writing such a fantastical story. So he gave himself the fictional given name Normal, which is exactly what a normal person would do. A typesetter working for the magazine accidentally interpreted the L as a typo, and Normal became Norman. Burroughs submitted his complete manuscript to the magazine, titled Dejah Thoris, Princess of Mars. Metcalf changed it to Under the Moons of Mars, and Burroughs received $400 for it, approximately $12,000 today. Under the Moons of Mars, published in All Story in 1912, later retitled A Princess of Mars when it was republished as a novel, is today considered a turning point in 20th century science fiction. It's noted as a seminal piece of work within the subgenre of planetary romance, or Sword and Planet, which is largely defined by adventures against the backdrop of an exotic alien world. The story follows the character John Carter, a Confederate Civil War veteran who, in a confrontation with Apache Indians, is accidentally and mysteriously teleported to the planet Mars, known by its inhabitants as Barsoom. John falls into the middle of a planetary conflict between different civilizations, rallying one side to victory and in the process winning the heart of the Red Martian's princess, Dejah Thoris. Burroughs was inspired by contemporary speculations about space and other planets, particularly those of astronomer Percival Lowell, who popularized the belief that Mars at one point sustained intelligent life. However, the Mars of the novel, due to its harsh environment, harbors populations that are war-hardened, barbaric, and quarrel over resources, which fuels the plot. The story was successful, though not enough that Burroughs was confident enough he could quit his job to focus on writing exclusively. There was enough interest in his work, however, that he was able to sell a sequel, Gods of Mars, to All Story for serialization again. While Burroughs' numerous ventures in different arenas to make money had all failed, his varied life experience gave him significant inspiration in his writing. He was able to draw from a wealth of experiences most average people otherwise had no exposure to. Even before Burroughs jumped from profession to profession, He claimed to have had several unique adventures in his youth as well. Though he was born in Chicago, Burroughs made the claim that he was actually born in Beijing, and that his father was a military advisor to the Dowager Empress, Cixi. He also later said he was at the Battle of Little Bighorn under the command of General Custer, claiming to be the sole survivor, which may have been the 19th century equivalent of saying you were at Waterloo. Also, this battle took place when Burroughs was quite literally 1 year old. All of this points to efforts by Burroughs to exoticize his own origins, but if anything, is another example of his vivid imagination. And the world he imagined in his work was highly influential. American science fiction author Ray Bradbury cited the series as inspiration for The Martian Chronicles. Flash Gordon drew heavily from the science fantasy/sword and planet subgenre of storytelling, which later influenced Star Wars. H.P. Lovecraft pulled ideas for one of his novellas, and James Cameron mentioned the influence on his concepts for Avatar. And with such a lasting legacy, it was inevitable that the series would eventually receive its own film adaptation to bring the story to the big screen for a wider audience. And Burroughs' work would be adapted by none other than one of the largest creative studios in the world.
Walt Disney Pictures proudly presents Tarzan.
Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote the first in his series of 24 Tarzan novels, Tarzan of the Apes, just after he penned A Princess of Mars in 1911. While he was working as a department manager for a business magazine, Burroughs wrote in his free time, according to him, scribbling on the backs of old letterheads and odd pieces of paper. Burroughs didn't have much faith in the story and wasn't sure that it would even sell, but he earned even more for this submission, a total of $700. He said in regard to any inspiration for the story, "I have tried to search my memory for some clue to the suggestions that gave me the idea. And as close as I can come to it, I believe it may have originated in my interest in mythology and the story of Romulus and Remus." The original Tarzan novel told the story of a boy raised by apes after his parents, a high society English couple, Lord and Lady Greystoke, are marooned and later die in the jungles of equatorial Africa. Tarzan is adopted by a gorilla named Kala, whose son was previously killed while she was escaping the king of the apes, Kerchak. Once an adult, Tarzan eventually engages Kerchak in a fight to the death, and in winning, becomes the new king of the apes. The novel follows Tarzan's conflicts with other human beings and reconciliation with who he is as he learns more about his past and how it influences him in the present. The story was wildly popular, becoming a massive success for Burroughs, and once it was printed in book form, it became a bestseller. Just like with the Barsoom series, Burroughs was spurred to write sequels, the next 6 installments arriving consistently year after year. There were several criticisms of the series, however. Some readers found the material a little too pulpy, with later entries in the lineup additionally being called derivative of both other sources and itself. The storytelling in particular was generally considered more titillating than of much significant depth. Besides just the literary shortcomings, Tarzan has also been criticized for some, even for the time, questionable themes of race, sex, and social order. Rudyard Kipling, author of The Jungle Book, another series centered on a human character raised by wild animals, was even quoted saying that Burroughs wrote Tarzan just so he could, quote, find out how bad a book he could write and get away with it. Despite the criticisms, Tarzan became one of the most iconic literary characters of all time, and just 6 years after being published in All Story, the first film adaptation was released. In 1918, Tarzan of the Apes debuted to American audiences. Burroughs sold the film rights for $5,000, approximately $160,000 today. This movie made Tarzan a household name, and is considered one of Hollywood's first blockbusters. It was popular enough that it spawned 3 sequels: The Romance of Tarzan, which came out the same year, The Son of Tarzan in 1920, and The Adventures of Tarzan in 1921. With several successful adaptations for mass media, Tarzan became a well-established franchise. And with the arrival of talkies, so too did a new film series, which contained no less than 12 installments and lasted from the 1930s all the way up to the 60s. In 1984, Greystoke, The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes was released, starring Christopher Lambert, Addie McDowell, and Ian Holm. This was the first Tarzan film to be nominated for any Academy Award, but not the last. The plot follows Tarzan from his upbringing in the jungle to his reclamation of his ancestral home, his initiation into human civilization, and eventual return to the jungle. The film was a fairly moderate success and received generally favorable reviews from both critics and audiences. Novelist Colin Greenland stated, "If there's a better film this year than Greystoke, I shall be astonished." This adaptation was arguably the most polished, regarded, big-budget, and generally favored entry in the canon of films, until 15 years later, when another pop-cultural behemoth added it to theirs. Disney's Tarzan was the first major motion animated picture to star the titular character, and contrary to the original novel and a number of previous adaptations, takes place exclusively in Africa. The idea was initially pitched by then studio chairman Jeffrey Katzenberg to director Kevin Lima, who read the original novel in preparation for the production. The then president of Walt Disney Feature Animation, Thomas Schumacher, stated in regards to the project, "What struck me most when reading the book was that Burroughs had created the perfect template for an animated film. Here is a book that cries out to be animated, yet we're the first filmmakers to have ever taken Tarzan from page to screen and presented the character as Burroughs intended." By the time this film went into production, there had already been a whopping 43 Tarzan motion pictures, and the team were asking themselves what they could do with the material that hadn't been done before. The answer was ultimately culminated in the theme: family. When he first read the novel, Kevin Lima described that the image of two hands held against one another jumped into his mind, and this became what was later referred to as the soul of the story. "I was trying to find a visual icon that would work on a basic level," he said. "It first appears when Kala lifts baby Tarzan into her arms, then again when he puts his hand up against Kala's and sees that he is different. It's this thematic through line that makes Disney's version stand out, and gives the movie its shape." Thomas Schumacher added, "The combination of the ultimate animation concept and this great story about who and what your family is seemed like a great idea. Frankly, our biggest deficit was that the title was so familiar that almost everyone had a preconceived notion of it. Ultimately, the filmmaker's strategy readapting the story and characters paid off. Upon release, Tarzan was #1 at the box office, ranking second behind The Lion King as the highest-earning box office opening for a Disney feature. The film made $34 million in its opening weekend and $448 million worldwide, just about 3.5 times its budget. Critics and audiences were incredibly enthusiastic in their reception, and though a significant number agreed that earlier films from the decade were stronger outings, Tarzan was a much more compelling entry compared to Disney's latest animated releases. Overall, the film was a big success, and not only earned Disney an Oscar win, but contributed to the studio's credibility in its artistic and narrative storytelling, becoming a classic right out of the gate. And once gold is struck somewhere, people tend to dig in adjacent places. Barely 10 years later, the studio returned to Burroughs' library to adapt the very first story the author published in his career. But they weren't the first to get there. In 1931, director and animator Bob Clampett, best known for his work on Looney Tunes, pitched to Burroughs his concept for an adaptation of A Princess of Mars. 6 years before Snow White, Clampett wanted to produce the world's first full-length animated film. "I had been fascinated with the Burroughs books since I was a youngster," Clampett said, "especially the Mars books. Realizing the potential of a fantasy series of cartoons based around Burroughs' characters, I went out to see Burroughs himself and tried to convince him that I could film and sell a series of cartoons based on his John Carter of Mars stories." Burroughs, to Clampett's surprise, was highly receptive to the idea, especially as, at the time, animation was really the only way to visually accomplish the spectacle within the books. Clampett also said that Burroughs knew if they were going to produce a successful adaptation, some departure from the source material was necessary. Edgar was smart enough to understand that one couldn't just literally translate his Mars books page by page into animation, Clampett said. So he gave me a great deal of freedom to dream up and be inspired by his writing and develop a cartoon story on my own. Burroughs' son Jack also became involved in the production of a showreel, and sculpted a number of models of creatures and characters to give Clampett a reference for how they would look and move. Animators Chuck Jones and Robert Cannon assisted Clampett, with Cannon actually acting as the live-action reference and his performance being used for some rotoscoped animation. Test footage was completed in 1936, depicting John Carter involved in a sword fight action sequence, a green Martian, also called a Thark, riding a mount, and a title sequence. Clampett showed the footage to MGM, and the executives loved it. Clampett began working on production shortly after when MGM's priorities shifted. According to him, the studio said, "No, we do not want the John Carter thing, we want Tarzan." Aesthetically, Jack Burrows and I were very inspired by the Mars project, and the idea, as much as I like Tarzan, to do the alternate series was simply not the same. Somehow, I just lost my enthusiasm for the new project. The animated Tarzan production also eventually fell through, and it wouldn't be until another 2 decades after Burrows' death that any other plans for adaptation of his Martian series would be pitched. Famous stop-motion animator Ray Harryhausen, best known for his work on Jason and the Argonauts, Columbia Pictures' Sinbad films, and Clash of the Titans, was interested in bringing the novels to the screen in the late 50s. Not much is known about Harryhausen's potential plans or ideas for the adaptation, but it didn't get past the conceptual stage before being abandoned. It's likely that the scale of the project was just too big. Taking place on an alien world with an array of alien creatures and monsters, the film would have been incredibly effects-heavy. Harryhausen, in consideration of just how demanding production would be, likely decided to move on out of concern that the story was too big to pull off within accepted parameters of budget and labor. After another 20 years, though, visual effects work had evolved significantly, and had inarguably shaped one of the biggest hits cinema had ever seen. In 1977, Star Wars premiered to unprecedented success, and absolutely captured the public's fascination. Suddenly, science fiction and anything adjacent to it was in vogue. Other studios were turning their heads towards any potential properties they could pluck to capitalize on Star Wars hype. In the 1980s, Mario Casar and Andrew G. Vajna, the producers behind the first 3 Rambo films, as well as Terminator 2 and 3 respectively, purchased the film rights to Burrows' novels for Walt Disney Studios. Jeffrey Katzenberg, a then new executive, helped facilitate this deal. The 80s were a difficult decade for the company, and the studio was looking desperately for a hit. In 1988, screenwriter Terry Black, who worked briefly on the project, said, "They want this to be the next Star Wars." After Black left, writers Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, who co-wrote Aladdin, Pirates of the Caribbean, and Shrek, were brought on to continue developing the script. John McTiernan was approached to direct. McTiernan had been behind the successive hits Predator, Die Hard, and The Hunt for Red October, and the studio believed he could bring the vision needed to a large-scale sci-fi action production. He hired screenwriter Bob Gale, known for Back to the Future, to take what had already been written and synthesize different elements from several previous drafts, as well as inject more humor into the script. By 1992, the 2 chosen lead actors were loosely attached: Julia Roberts as Princess Dejah Thoris, and Tom Cruise as John Carter. There was a problem, however. McTiernan was helming a big production, one that demanded a huge amount of visual development and effects work, and he had encountered the same dilemma as Ray Harryhausen before him, nearly 4 decades earlier. Technology had limitations. McTiernan didn't believe visual effects were advanced enough yet to faithfully fulfill the vision of Burrows' novels. He wanted to use computer imagery, but utilizing computers to create photoreal visuals was still quite experimental. This was approximately a year before the release of Jurassic Park, the film that convinced George Lucas technology was finally ready to execute his vision for the Star Wars prequels. Ultimately, McTiernan walked away from the project to direct Last Action Hero, which was, ironically, flattened at the box office by none other than Jurassic Park. The rights to the property subsequently remained in purgatory for some time after Casar and Vajna's production company fell into bankruptcy, which resulted in a bidding war between Paramount and Columbia Pictures. Producer James Jacks at Paramount remembered the Barsoom books from childhood and pushed for their purchase. Paramount eventually won the rights, and none other than Robert Rodriguez, the man who made these movies,
"He ruined my dream journal! I did not!"
was brought on to direct. The plan was to use a filming technique on digital stages to create Barsoom's environment. Shooting was set to start in 2005, but the year before, Rodriguez had resigned from the Directors Guild of America. Paramount was unwilling to hire a non-union director, and Rodriguez was let go. Kerry Conran, who had directed the similarly pulp-inspired Sky Captain and the World of Tomorrow, replaced him, and the script was given yet another rewrite by Aaron Kruger. Plans were made to shoot in the Australian outback, but before any shooting could begin, both Conran and Kruger, for unknown reasons, left. Amazingly, the studio was not discouraged by all of these subsequent production difficulties. Almost immediately, screenwriter Mark Fergus came on board, and alongside him to direct, Jon Favreau. Favreau and Fergus wanted to remain true to the novels, specifically the first 3 in the series, and as opposed to the previous filmmakers attached to the project, also wanted to use practical effects. Favreau specifically cited the 1968 Planet of the Apes as his inspiration. But like their predecessors, Favreau and Fergus soon left the project to work on another film, something called Iron Man. I don't know, I don't think it was a big hit. Yet another writer and director had departed the project, leaving the production in limbo once more. But its status had been under the eye of another man in the industry, someone who not only had been following the production for years, but was a massive fan of the original material. Andrew Stanton was one of Pixar's very first animators hired to the studio, which he joined in 1990 when it was still an extended arm of Industrial Light and Magic. Stanton co-wrote Toy Story, A Bug's Life, Monsters, Inc., and wrote and directed Finding Nemo and WALL-E. He had read the Barsoom novels in high school, as well as Marvel Comics adaptation that ran in the late 70s. He told journalist Drew Taylor in an interview for The Wrap regarding a film adaptation, "That's something I have spent my whole life wishing somebody would make. And when I was in the industry from maybe the 90s on, if I ever heard even the slightest rumor it might get made, I would get all excited like a fanboy and go, I'll be the first in line to go and see it. I never had the hubris to think that's something I would want to do or could do." After Favreau left the project, he said, "It was one of those kismet moments where I'm like, it's so crazy, it might just work." Disney had lost the rights to the property after the dissolution of Kassar and Vajna's production company, and they still remained with Paramount. But Stanton wouldn't have to incite another bidding war to get them back. In August 2006, Paramount ultimately decided not to renew the film rights, instead choosing to shift their focus to another sci-fi property. Paramount chose to hedge their bets on rebooting a more well-known science fiction series, and Andrew Stanton went about lobbying the Disney studio to reacquire the rights. He made what he called an impassioned plea to executives, pitching the idea as Indiana Jones on Mars. The studio was skeptical of the concept and of the screenplay, which was considered hard to follow. Stanton had also never directed a live-action film before, but according to him, he had nothing to lose. "It wasn't like I had to do this in the sense of I have no career or that I needed the next paycheck or something like that." Stanton told executives, "I think these things are about to fall into public domain, and I think you could reinterpret them to be something that could be digested today. I remember saying, fine if I don't make it, but you should be the ones making it. And I meant it. I thought it had the potential to just be a big franchise." As Stanton had overcome similar pre-production hurdles faced on his directorial outings with Pixar, the studio approved the project, and approved Stanton as director. And if the film was as successful as Stanton hoped it would be, Disney teased the idea of follow-ups based on later installments in the original series of novels. By 2008, the first draft of what was imagined as part 1 of a trilogy of films was completed, and in April 2009, writer Michael Chabon was brought on board to refine the script. Chabon was similarly passionate about the project, having also grown up with the original series. Stanton didn't just want to cast big names, but a familiar face was looking to reattach themselves to the production: Tom Cruise. Cruise was campaigning for the part back, but Stanton had already honed in on Taylor Kitsch for the titular role. The director did state there were discussions, but his decision had already been made. Lynn Collins was cast as Dejah Thoris in her first major role, and Willem Dafoe, who had worked with Stanton previously on Finding Nemo, was cast as Tarkis, the leader of the Tharks. Computer visual effects were the vehicle the filmmakers used to realize the Tharks as well as the other alien creatures on Barsoom. Dafoe was in full motion capture gear for his role, and on top of that, also performed on stilts to capture the height of the character. He described it as physically demanding, stating, "I was also wearing a camera on my head. It was very involved. 5 months on stilts was quite an achievement." But Dafoe added that it was a fun challenge and was pleasantly surprised that despite Stanton's background in animation, he refused to rely heavily on the visual effects to carry the production. "When we started these scenes," Dafoe said, "there was no, oh, the CGI will do that, or they'll do that in post." Ultimately, the experience on set was largely a positive one, even with the difficulties that inevitably occur on every production. By all accounts, the shoot didn't exceed budgetary estimates, cast got along, and no integral members of production, for the very first time on a Barsoom project it seemed, were leaving or getting replaced. The single element that raised eyebrows, specifically from those outside of the production rather than those from within it, was that additional photography was planned more than a year after the initial shoot. Stanton said that this was planned from the very beginning, and this comes directly from his experience in animation. Animated productions are often made and remade numerous times during the pre-production and production processes. Artists reboard and restructure scenes and shift narrative elements time and time again. As Stanton put it, they put on a bad dress rehearsal again and again and again, and change whatever we do until it's better. I've never been a part of a movie where you can make it once and it works. I literally remember saying, if that's what you demand of me, let's not do this. I said, can we take part of the budget and, up front, already put on the calendar, we're going to have this amount of time and money to finish either what we didn't finish shooting on the first go-around, or to correct what we got off on. As per Stanton's request, the studio agreed to it. Unfortunately, the word reshoot often sounds like a death knell to outside observers, and this was the first ripple in the pond of public opinion. Even though additional photography is typically built into most large-scale productions nowadays, it carries a worrying connotation, and that wasn't the only difficulty the team now had to grapple with in terms of public perception. The studio chief who greenlit John Carter, Dick Cook, was replaced during production. Executive Rich Ross filled his shoes, transitioning from the company's television division. Ross had no experience with feature films, and the studio's then new executives within the marketing and production divisions had little more. At the same time, unbeknownst to any of the filmmakers, Disney CEO Bob Iger was in talks with George Lucas to purchase Star Wars. If the deal went through, it would in many respects be a repeat of Paramount's decision to favor Star Trek over John Carter half a decade earlier. If the studio had a handle on a popular sci-fi property audiences were already familiar with, one of the most popular franchises in the world no less, then the incentive to produce a successful competitor was effectively nullified, endangering John Carter's potential sequels before the first film had even come out. Besides the inexperienced marketing team, another damaging hit to selling the film came in the form of its very title. The film was originally called John Carter of Mars. Despite being based off of the first book, A Princess of Mars, the decision was made early on to change it to the last... The decision was made early on to change it to the last entry in the novel series, as according to Stanton, not a single boy would go. Disney actually attributed part of the lacking box office performance of The Princess and the Frog to the very same thing. But there was still a concern about the title on the part of executives. Michael Chabon attended a meeting led by Disney's new president of movie marketing, M.T. Carney. Carney was yet another executive who lacked much, if any, experience in film, previously coming from a New York marketing agency that specialized in packaged goods. I'm so sorry, Andrew. There were two issues she and other execs were concerned with, and both of them had to do with the of Mars portion of the title. Obviously, it denoted the film's genre, science fiction. But the studio wants to get butts in seats, and unfortunately, according to some corporate survey somewhere, half of all butts in the world are not interested in sci-fi, and thus are not going to see this film. Disney is not the only studio to have this fear, but according to the marketing experts, women don't like science fiction, which is why I made all of these videos. And this one. But just in case female audiences were able to gather through basic common sense and other marketing material that this was actually one of those sci-fi things that they apparently hate, Disney execs believed that the sex appeal of Taylor Kitsch being shirtless throughout the runtime... Disney execs believed that the sex appeal of Taylor Kitsch being shirtless throughout the runtime would draw them to theaters like moths to a flame. The other concern on the part of executives was that films with Mars in the title were doomed to fail. Chabon said that Carney went through a list of 15 different films, citing that 11 of them, including Disney productions like Mission to Mars and the recent bomb Mars Needs Moms, were huge failures. Chabon also noted that most of these films had very little to do with each other besides the title. Almost all of them, he said, were bad movies. The meeting concluded with Carney telling the group, "We're taking Mars out of the title. It's just going to be called John Carter."
John Carter of Mars. Sounds much better.
Chabon reported, "That was the first moment I was like, oh fuck. This is not good. We may be in trouble here." From that meeting until it came out, it was not good after that. Stanton simply said it was not his call, noting in reference to Carney that she was, quote, confident in her views on which directions we should take. When marketing finally began to take shape and trailers were released, the landscape did not improve. They didn't showcase much action or the effects work, and were criticized for failing to highlight the source material or the prominent filmmakers themselves in any capacity. And with the abbreviated title, audiences were still vague on what the film was actually selling. Disney's inexperienced marketing team did not come up with ideas to boost interest either. There was little to no tie-in merchandise, no promotion at the theme parks, no material released to raise awareness about the original and highly influential source material, or specials on the production or making of. Disney is a marketing powerhouse, and is usually famously intuitive and crafty with their almost subliminal campaigns, which they conducted before to promote one of Stanton's previous films.
I started selling you stuff about Finding Nemo a year and a half before Nemo came out. I think we called them fishy facts, and it was all stuff to get kids interested in fish, so that when it came out, you liked fish.
And these kids were like, this is perfect because I'm already into fish coincidentally.
Uh-huh.
But it was not a coincidence.
No.
Okay, that's a little sinister.
They did, however, create a global contest called Are You the Real John Carter? If your name was legally John Carter, you could win an opportunity to attend a fan screening of the film. Yes, this was real. Ultimately, besides a Super Bowl spot, there was very little mainstream marketing for the public to even be aware of. It has been called one of the worst marketing campaigns in movie history. A former marketing chief for the studio was quoted as saying, "It's almost as if they went out of their way to make us not care." Unfortunately, a billboard with the name John Carter does not inform a potential viewer much about the product being sold. Reportedly, Stanton was under the impression that there was enough public awareness of the original books that the lack of clarity wouldn't have been much of an issue. In an interview with Vulture, another executive's response to this was, "People don't say, 'I know what I'll be for Halloween. I'll be John Carter.'" Willem Dafoe recalled, "I remember before the movie was even seen, people were counting it out." Upon release, John Carter only grossed $281 million worldwide, on a production budget of $307 million, which did not include the marketing. Not even 2 weeks after the film had been out, Disney took out a $200 million write-down on it. Both Rich Ross and M.T. Carney left the studio very soon after. Usually, when films suffer this degree of failure, to the point that executives resign, it really does boil down to quality. Sometimes a film fails, just like those on the list Carney cited, because it isn't very good. But that, tragically, was not the case with John Carter. The team that comprised the film's production crew was incredibly passionate, and had a frankly unenviable job of adapting a pulpy, century-old science fiction series into a captivating Hollywood film. And they had inherited a production that struggled to get off the ground for nearly a century itself. Andrew Stanton noted that he came onto the production feeling mildly intimidated, but 3 months in said to producers, "Is it just me, or do we know how to do this better than live-action crews do?" Despite the wide jump between directing in animation and live action, Stanton was, by all reports, an incredibly flexible, compassionate, and competent director for everyone to work with. Taylor Kitsch said, "I fight with my director on every film, but I never had a fight with Andrew. Even on day 80 in the miserable fucking desert, because I respect him so much." That isn't to say production was a walk in the park. It was an expensive shoot, especially given the amount of effect shots that had to be completed, as well as their intricacy and the sheer volume of characters and objects on screen. The reshoots were also a struggle, particularly for Lynn Collins and her character, as there were concerns about how she would resonate with audiences, and later editions had her softened in an attempt to make her more likable and appealing to the audience. Co-director for Tarzan, Chris Buck, stated back during development in 1996, "I find Burroughs' Tarzan intriguing in his intensity and introspection, but am concerned that he may come across as too grim for our film. He's kind of a loner in the book, and it may be difficult for the audience to get behind his character. We can't allow our Tarzan to become too grim. We need to employ the emotional side of this story. The character relationships need to be at the core of our film." And that element may have gotten lost in the massive, sweeping scale of John Carter and the Barsoom series. John Carter in the books is a bit more pugnacious and sometimes even a little obtuse, but he's also chivalrous and honorable to a fault, while Stanton adapted him into a damaged cynic, plagued by a deep loss and personal tragedy. While an adaptation can be faithful, that faithfulness does not always translate to quality in the context of a new medium or narrative. Sometimes, in order to make a cohesive product, elements have to be shifted around in order to keep the story consistent and allow it to function on its own. If Tarzan was as stoic, independent, and detached in the film as he was in the books, then his character wouldn't fit the narrative nearly as effectively. The Disney film rejected the narrative pushing Tarzan to return to London, for example, because it shifted focus away from the characters, and what Kevin Lima described as the central thematic concept, the theme of family. And it appears that in most respects, Stanton and his team recognized that too. While the film is a bit long and arguably suffers a small degree from pacing as it crawls towards the third act, this was not the complete disaster that coverage following the premiere made it out to be. Unfortunately, there were a lot of factors working against John Carter, and the media storm that followed its release only made audiences less inclined to give it a chance. If people had heard of the film, it was via this negative commentary, and not the actual marketing. Thomas Schumacher made the statement in the late 90s that Tarzan was already such a massive name and presence in popular culture that people brought preconceived notions to the film. But no one knew who John Carter was. I know you did, comment section, but this was not a title the general public had much awareness of. And Schumacher's comments regarding Tarzan's adaptability and animation could arguably apply to the Barsoom series as well. Fantastic worlds and abstract concepts, aliens, ancient history, and great wars, just like Bob Clampett originally intended. And yet, ironically, despite being helmed by a director and a studio known for animation, John Carter was a live-action film the studio likely intended to replicate the successes of titles like Lord of the Rings, Pirates of the Caribbean, or that one movie Jon Favreau himself jumped ship to be a part of. A big action epic that would draw in big numbers. Being an animated film would not have necessarily saved John Carter, but it is a curious alternative that may have given us a wholly different story entirely. Unfortunately, on top of every other hill the production had to climb, the legacy of Burroughs' books and their influence had already seen that the concepts he originated were adapted to the screen before his work itself was. Decades earlier, producer James Jacks actually took the Barsoom books to director Robert Zemeckis for a potential adaptation. Zemeckis read the material and replied, "I don't think so. George Lucas has really plundered these books." The very same thing happened with Valerian, another landmark science fiction property that gave rise to franchises which went on to garner far more success than their inspirations. Despite being two completely different productions, the way filmmakers went about adapting Burroughs' original works into films was not entirely dissimilar. Stanton approached John Carter with an animator's eye, and focused on how to keep the film character-driven and give the audience a real emotional hook. It wasn't that Tarzan was adaptable and A Princess of Mars simply wasn't. The material wasn't doomed to failure, and an animator in the director's chair didn't sabotage the production. In private test screenings, John Carter performed very well. With critics, reviews were generally positive. But when selling something, it's much easier to stir public awareness about it if the idea already occupies some space in the culture. It's much harder to get people excited about something they've never heard of. At the end of the day, Disney effectively marketed Tarzan. And thanks in part to that, the Disney version of this story is arguably the first one that comes to mind if it's brought up. But people still don't know who John Carter is. The studio just didn't crack the code when it came to getting the public's attention. Regardless of the box office performance, however, John Carter does remain remembered and enjoyed by the people who did see it. Lynn Collins has said that some have reached out to her to express how much the film impacted their lives, and that her character inspired them. She said, "I ultimately think a movie that is polarizing is good no matter what, because that's what art is supposed to do. It's supposed to provoke. It's supposed to inspire. It's supposed to catalyze. And I think that's what this movie did." And by all accounts, Stanton and his team appeared to have a huge amount of fun, among a series of intense challenges, in making this film. Despite how history may look back on it, it seems a very similar attitude production-wise was embraced on the set to the one Burroughs himself had in his writings. "In all these years," he said, I have not learned one single rule for writing fiction. I still write as I did 30 years ago. Stories which I feel would entertain me, knowing that there are millions of people just like me who will like the same things I like. Anyway, I have great fun with my imaginings, and I can appreciate, in a small way, the swell time God had in creating the universe.